Using cinematic illustrations and historical records, this is the story of the first 24 hours of D-Day. Before the day was over, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers would land on the coast of occupied France. Thousands would be wounded or killed, and the future of Western Europe would hang on whether those men could hold a few miles of hostile shoreline. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, nothing was guaranteed. Paratroopers were already dropping into darkness, many scattered far from their objectives. On the beaches, German defenses waited behind concrete, wire, and steel. At sea, thousands of ships moved steadily toward the coast, carrying an invasion force unlike anything the world had seen before. If the landings failed, there would be no second attempt that year. The war in Europe would drag on, and the cost would be measured in years, not months. What followed was not a single battle, but hundreds of smaller ones, fought by brave but frightened men in unfamiliar terrain, with incomplete information and no easy way back. By nightfall, the invasion would either be held, or Europe would remain under German occupation. This is how the longest day began. In the hours before sunrise, the English Channel was alive with movement. Warships, troop transports, and landing craft stretched to the horizon, advancing through darkness toward the coast of Normandy. Engines rumbled softly. Orders were spoken in low voices. Most men had little to do now but wait. On the decks and below them, soldiers checked weapons they already knew by heart. Some wrote letters they would never send. Others stared into the black water, trying not to imagine what waited beyond it. They had trained for this moment for months, rehearsing landings, memorizing maps, learning which beach exits to find if they survived the first minutes ashore. But training could not prepare them for what came next. Across the channel, the French coastline was still and dark. German defenders manned bunkers and strong points overlooking the beaches, some alert, others unaware of the armada approaching them. The invasion was already underway, but for most of the men who would fight it, the war had not yet begun. That would change with the rising sun. As the fleet closed in on the French coast, the waiting became harder. Inside the landing craft, men sat shoulder to shoulder, packed tightly with their equipment. The air was thick with fuel fumes and seawater. Some were seasick, others silent. There was little conversation now. Most soldiers were left alone with their thoughts. Of a home, a family, of the minutes ahead. They knew the plan in broad terms, but few knew what their own landing would look like. They did not know whether the bombardment would succeed. They did not know which exits would be open or which units would make it ashore. What they did know was simple. Once the ramp dropped, there was no retreat. Among them were veterans of North Africa and Italy and men who had never seen combat at all. Regular soldiers, engineers, medics, each with a role to play, if they survived long enough to play it. Some prayed, some tried to joke. Most simply waited for the order they knew was coming. For many, the invasion of Europe would begin in the space of a few seconds, between the sound of the ramp lowering and the moment they stepped into the water. D-Day was the opening move of Operation Overlord, the Allied plan to break into occupied Western Europe. 5 assault beaches stretched along the Normandy coast, from west to east: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. American forces would land at Utah and Omaha, British and Canadian troops at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Behind the beaches, airborne divisions were tasked with securing bridges, road junctions, and key terrain meant to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. The objective for the first day was not a breakout, it was survival. If the Allies could land, link their forces, and hold ground long enough to bring in men and supplies, the invasion might succeed. If they were pushed back into the sea, it would be a catastrophe felt across the entire war. Every part of the plan depended on timing, coordination, and momentum, and every delay increased the danger. By dawn, thousands of men would be fighting on land, at sea, and in the air. The largest seaborne invasion in history would be tested, not in theory, but in blood and confusion, and it was already beginning to unravel. Shortly after midnight, the invasion reached France from the air. Hundreds of transport aircraft crossed the Normandy coast, carrying American and British airborne divisions tasked with shaping the battlefield before the beach landings began. Their mission was clear in theory: secure bridges, block roads, hold key terrain long enough to delay German counterattacks. In practice, almost nothing went to plan. Heavy cloud, anti-aircraft fire, and navigational errors scattered the formations. Paratroopers jumped into darkness, many miles from their intended drop zones. Some landed in flooded fields, others in hedgerows, villages, or directly on top of German positions. Small groups formed wherever men could find each other. Officers and radios were lost. Units became fragments. Yet in that confusion, something unexpected happened. Without waiting for orders that would never arrive, airborne troops began attacking objectives on their own initiative. blowing bridges, seizing road junctions, and sowing uncertainty behind German lines. As the first light approached the coast, the invasion was already being fought far inland by men who had landed alone, in the dark, with no clear way back. As airborne fighting spread across Normandy, the invasion fleet reached its firing positions offshore. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers turned their guns toward the coast. At first light, the silence broke. Heavy shells tore into German coastal defenses, smashing bunkers, strong points, and gun emplacements that overlooked the beaches. For miles along the shore, the land shook under the weight of the bombardment. From the ships, it appeared overwhelming. Many Allied planners believed the bombardment would cripple the defenses before the first landing craft arrived. That belief would soon be tested. Smoke and dust obscured the coastline. Some German positions were destroyed, others survived, protected by thick concrete, buried deep into the bluffs. As the guns fell silent, the invasion moved into its most dangerous phase. Landing craft began their final runs toward the beaches. Men watched the bombardment lift, unsure of what it had truly achieved. In minutes, the fate of the assault would no longer depend on firepower from the sea, but on what waited for them beyond the surf. As the firing ended, the landing craft began their final approach. For the men inside the craft, the bombardment had offered brief reassurance. Now, with the fire lifted, that reassurance faded. They could see the beaches ahead. Dark shapes along the waterline, obstacles driven into the sand, gaps where explosions had torn the coastline apart, and stretches where nothing appeared to have changed at all. Officers shouted final instructions over the noise of engines and the waves. Men checked their weapons one last time. Some tightened helmet straps. Others stared straight ahead, unwilling to look anywhere else. The landing craft were exposed now, vulnerable to artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire from the shore. There would be no cover after the ramps dropped. As the distance closed, the reality of the invasion became impossible to ignore. In moments, the waiting would end. The plan would give way to instinct, and survival would depend on what happened in the first few steps onto the beach. At Omaha Beach, the invasion met its greatest test. Here, the German defenses were largely intact. The naval bombardment had failed to destroy many of the bunkers overlooking the sand, and the bluffs rose steeply from the shoreline, giving defenders clear fields of fire. When the ramps dropped, American troops stepped into chaos. Machine gun fire swept the beach. Mortars and artillery struck among the landing craft. Units became pinned down almost immediately, unable to move forward or retreat. Men sought cover behind obstacles meant to block vehicles, iron hedgehogs, wooden stakes, shingle banks barely high enough to conceal them. Medics moved through open fire to reach the wounded. Officers were killed or wounded within minutes. For a time, the invasion at Omaha teetered on the edge of failure. There was no single breakthrough, no coordinated push inland. Instead, progress came in fragments. Leadership passed to whoever was still standing. Orders were improvised. The plan, as written, no longer mattered. By late morning, scattered American units had reached the base of the bluffs. The cost had been severe, but the beach had not been lost. Omaha was not yet secure, but the invasion had survived its most dangerous hours. While there were struggles at Omaha, the invasion unfolded differently along the rest of the coast. At Utah Beach, American forces landed farther from their intended position, pushed off course by strong currents. What could have been a disaster instead reduced resistance. The beach was lightly defended, and units moved inland more quickly than expected. To the east, British and Canadian troops came ashore at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Here, the fighting was still intense. Strong points resisted. Towns had to be cleared street by street. Casualties mounted steadily. But momentum mattered. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Armor began to land. Beach exits were opened, allowing men and equipment to move inland. Progress was uneven, and objectives were only partially met. Some towns remained in German hands. Planned link-ups between forces were delayed. Yet the crucial fact remained. The landings were holding. By midday, tens of thousands of Allied troops were ashore across multiple beaches. Supplies were flowing in behind them. The invasion, though far from secure, had gained a foothold that could not easily be erased. For the first time that day, the outcome no longer depended on a single stretch of sand. D-Day did not succeed because everything went according to plan. It succeeded because when the plan collapsed, men adapted. Across the beaches and inland, units found themselves leaderless, scattered, and cut off from communication. Maps were lost, radios failed, orders never arrived. In their place came improvisation. Non-commissioned officers assumed command. Small groups combined with whoever they could find. Objectives were reinterpreted, delayed, or abandoned entirely in favor of what was possible. At Omaha, breakthroughs were measured in yards, not miles. At the other beaches, advances were shaped by terrain, resistance, and opportunity rather than timetables. This was not coordinated warfare as designed in briefing rooms. It was adaptation under fire. German defenders faced an enemy that could not be neatly contained. Instead of a single front, they encountered dozens of small thrusts that the enemy struggled to predict. By the afternoon of June 6th, the invasion no longer resembled the original plan, but it was still moving forward. What mattered now was persistence rather than precision. And as the day wore on, that persistence began to change the balance. By early afternoon, the battle had moved beyond the shoreline. Across Normandy, Allied units pushed inland from the beaches into a landscape that offered no easy advances. Narrow roads, sunken lanes, and thick hedgerows broke formations apart and limited visibility. Progress was slow. Villages had to be cleared one building at a time. Road junctions were fought over repeatedly. German resistance stiffened as defenders regrouped away from the chaos of the beaches. For many soldiers, the fighting now felt smaller and more personal. There were no sweeping maneuvers, only short advances, sudden firefights, and long pauses under cover. At Omaha, the push inland remained fragile. At the other beaches, gains were uneven and often fell short of planned objectives. Each yard taken inland made it harder for German forces to contain the invasion. Each road secured widened the breach that had been forced open that morning. By mid-afternoon, the invasion had become something new. No longer an assault on the coast, but a growing presence that could not easily be pushed back into the sea. For the German defenders, the scale of the invasion was still unclear. Reports arrived slowly and often contradicted one another. Paratroopers had been sighted inland. Landings were underway along multiple beaches. Communications were disrupted. German units waited for orders that did not come. High Command hesitated, uncertain whether Normandy was the main invasion or a diversion. Armored reserves remained held back, awaiting authorization that would arrive too late to matter. On the ground, local commanders attempted counterattacks where they could, but Allied air power limited movement in daylight and coordination proved difficult. Every hour that passed worked against the defenders. As Allied troops pushed inland and supplies continued to land on the beaches, the opportunity to contain the invasion narrowed. By late afternoon, the question was no longer whether the landings could be repelled, but how much ground could be held before the situation worsened. And as evening approached, the balance of the campaign had begun to shift. As the fighting spread inland, the balance of power above Normandy became increasingly clear. Allied aircraft filled the skies throughout the day, fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes operating almost without interruption. They struck road junctions, bridges, and German troop movements wherever they could be found. For German forces, daylight movement became dangerous. Columns attempting to redeploy were broken apart from the air. Supplies were delayed or abandoned. Counterattacks that required speed and coordination slowed to a crawl. For Allied troops on the ground, air superiority did not remove the danger, but it shaped the battlefield around them. German units were forced to move at night. Communication became more difficult. Local resistance remained fierce, but large-scale maneuver became increasingly risky. Above the beaches and the fields beyond them, control of the sky gave the invasion room to breathe. All the Allies needed was time to organize. They didn't need to win the war in one day, and with every hour that passed under Allied air cover, that time was being secured. By late afternoon, the price of the invasion was impossible to ignore. The beaches were littered with wreckage, damaged landing craft, discarded equipment, shattered obstacles. Medics worked continuously, moving the wounded away from the waterline where they could. For those still fighting, exhaustion set in. Units were under strength. Officers were missing. Many men had been awake for more than 24 hours, moving from tension to violence and back again. There was no sense of victory, only the knowledge that the beachheads had been held, and that holding them had come at a terrible cost. Along the coast, the dead were gathered where they fell. Inland, the wounded were evacuated as best they could be. The scale of what had happened was only beginning to register. D-Day would be remembered as a turning point. But for those who fought through its first day, it was measured in survival, and in the faces of men who would not be leaving Normandy with them. As the sun began to set over Normandy, the sound of fighting slowly receded from the beaches. Along the shoreline, smoke still drifted in the evening air. Wrecked landing craft lay where they had grounded hours earlier. Men moved carefully among the obstacles, exhausted and alert, unsure of what the night would bring. Inland, Allied units dug in where they could. Positions were improvised, perimeters were thin. Many objectives planned for the first day remained out of reach. There was no sense of relief, only the knowledge that the invasion had not been driven back into the sea, and that holding what had been taken would now be the priority. Across the front, soldiers prepared for the possibility of German counterattacks after dark. Weapons were cleaned, watches were set. June 6th was ending, but the battle for Normandy was only beginning. Measured against the original plans, D-Day fell short. Not all beach exits were secured. Key towns remained in German hands. Links between some Allied forces had yet to be made, yet the day's true achievement lay elsewhere. By nightfall, 5 Allied beachheads still held. More than 100,000 troops were ashore. Supplies and reinforcements continued to land across the beaches. The German defenders had failed to contain the invasion on the first day, the only moment when it might realistically have been stopped. D-Day was not a decisive victory, but it was a decisive foothold. From that foothold, the campaign in Western Europe would unfold, slowly, painfully, and at great cost. What mattered now was not how far the Allies had advanced, but that they had arrived and remained. When night fell on June 6th, the invasion did not end. It settled in. Across Normandy, Allied forces prepared for the days ahead. German counterattacks were expected, supplies continued to move ashore, the front line remained fragile and incomplete. The success of D-Day did not mean immediate victory. In the weeks that followed, the fighting would intensify. Hedgerows would become killing grounds, towns would be fought over repeatedly, casualties would mount on both sides. Normandy would not fall quickly. But the first and most dangerous barrier had been crossed. The Allies had returned to Western Europe in force, and this time they were not leaving. From the beaches of Normandy, the war would now move eastward, slowly, relentlessly, at immense cost. The outcome of the conflict was still uncertain, but its direction had changed. In the early hours of June 7th, the Normandy coastline lay quiet once more. The sea that had carried the invasion now moved calmly against the shore. Wreckage remained where it had been left. The marks of battle stretched along miles of beach. For those who had survived the first day, there was no sense of achievement, only exhaustion, loss, and the knowledge that the fight was far from over. D-Day would later be remembered as a turning point, a single date that symbolized the beginning of the end. But on that first night, it was something else entirely. It was a day endured, a day defined not by victory but by survival, and by the thousands of individual decisions made under fire. History would remember this day as the moment Europe began to be liberated. But that outcome rested on one simple fact. The invasion had held, and because it held, everything that followed became possible. This was the first 24 hours of D-Day,